You've got a government test coming up. You know you're going to be asked to write an essay, and you know that in that essay you're going to have to reference foundational documents. The bad news is you don't know which ones. The other bad news is you may not remember much about them because it may have been an entire semester since you took the class. What should you do? You should read those documents. You should complete any assigned work that your teacher gave you in class. But that test is coming up soon. So here's an overview of all the foundational documents, just the basics. Hopefully we can help you.
Here's a quick overview of the foundational documents for AP United States Government and Politics. Document number 1 is the Declaration of Independence, 1776. You all know that, written by Thomas Jefferson. What do you need to know about it? Well, it argues that a government is based upon natural rights. Thomas Jefferson was influenced by earlier Enlightenment thinkers, people like John Locke, and we can see that with his claim that all individuals are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and he says they are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds very similar to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property that had been written years earlier. Essentially, the document is a list of complaints about the king, is essentially a breakup letter between the colonies and the British Crown. It says, in short, it's not me, it's you. Jefferson lays out all the grievances and says, because of all these things, you have broken your contract, you have violated natural rights, and now we're going to issue a statement of separation. After the United States declared its independence, it needed to create a government. And that brings us to our second foundational document, the often overlooked but very important Articles of Confederation, originally written in 1777. This is more or less a wartime document that explains the relationship between the 13 original states. It says that they are a firm league of friendship. It is a weak central government. That is what a confederation is. Most power is retained by the individual members. And so it says very clearly that each state will retain its sovereignty, its freedom, and its independence in this new government going forward. It worked well enough during the war, but when peacetime came, it's going to have some problems. Essentially, there was going to be equality among all the states within Congress or the legislative branch. Every state had one vote. There was no executive branch, no one to enforce the laws. There was no judicial branch. The central government lacked the power to tax, and it lacked the power to enforce laws. This is very representative of the feelings that people had at the time about the fear of a strong central government. You'll know from history class that the problems with the Confederation became very clear in the 1780s, and ultimately, following Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, there's going to be stronger calls for reform, which is going to lead us to the Constitutional Convention and our next foundational document, the big one, the Constitution of the United States. This is not only a foundational document, this is basically the bedrock of any American government class. But let's very, very quickly go through the basics. There are 7 articles in the Constitution of the United States. Articles 1, 2, and 3 represent the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Article 1 being the longest, most detailed. Article 2, the executive branch. And then Article 3, the judicial branch. Article 4 talks about the obligations of the states, how they interact with one another, for example. Full faith and credit means that states have to respect the laws and decisions of other states. Privileges and immunities have to deal with how states treat the citizens of other states. And it is also in Article 4 where there is the guarantee that every state will have a republican form of government. Article 5 deals with how the Constitution is to be amended. Obviously, the framers of the Constitution intended for the Constitution to be amended. That's why they spelled it out very clearly how future generations could go about changing it. Essentially, it requires a 2/3 vote at a federal level. Most commonly, that is Congress, but there could be a national convention. And then 3/4 of the states have to ratify any amendment to the Constitution. That can be done either through 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of special conventions called for that purpose. Article 6 has the Supremacy Clause. This is the part of the Constitution that says it is the supreme law of the land. And then Article 7 explains how the Constitution itself will be ratified. It was going to require 9 of the states at that time. Moving on, there are a few basic principles that exist within the Constitution: popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, republicanism, judicial review, and federalism. Popular sovereignty means that ultimately sovereignty lies with the people. It says that right in the beginning, we the people. Limited government, meaning a government cannot do anything and everything that it wants to do, that it is limited by its creation. Separation of powers, meaning each department of the government, each branch of the government has its own unique powers. Checks and balances says that each branch of the government has the ability to limit or check other branches. Republicanism means the idea of a government made up of representatives of people. Judicial review, while not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, it is alluded to, is the idea that the court gets to interpret the meaning and potentially, as we will see, declare acts of Congress and actions of the executive unconstitutional. And federalism is, of course, the division of power between a central or federal government and the state governments. The Constitution has aspects of various types of democracy. We can see this with participatory, in which individuals, voters, are able to directly elect their members of the House of Representatives. It also has elitist, in the fact that there are aspects of the Constitution where the people have indirect influence. This would be with the election of senators, which were originally chosen by state legislatures. That's going to change with the 17th Amendment. And the Electoral College, which of course we still use today, where presidents are indirectly elected by the people. You also will need to know the 27 amendments for the AP exam. Now, it is unlikely that you'd ever be asked to name all 27, but let's talk really quickly about some of the big ones. Number one, of course, is the Bill of Rights, the original 10 amendments. These deal with primarily civil liberties. You have your First Amendment with your freedom of speech and petition and religion and so on and so forth. You have your amendments that deal with the rights of the accused, the Fifth and the Sixth, so on and so forth. You're going to need to know the 10th Amendment, the final amendment in the Bill of Rights, which is the States' Rights Amendment, which says that all powers not delegated to the central government or prevented or prohibited by the Constitution belong to the states and to the people. The 14th Amendment. Man, this is a big one. This is the one that makes all the other amendments mean more. It has the Equal Protection Clause. It is the one that takes the Bill of Rights and it applies them to the states. And then there's a handful of amendments that have to do with the expansion of democracy, or at least give more influence to voters. The 15th says you can't be denied the right to vote based on the color of one's skin. The 17th allows for the direct election of senators. The 19th, you cannot be denied the right to vote based on sex. The 23rd gives Washington, D.C., the residents in Washington, the ability to vote for President of the United States for the Electoral College. The 24th bans poll taxes. The 26th says you cannot be denied the right to vote based on your age if your age is over 18. Now let's get into a few of the documents that critique the Constitution. So we're going to start with Brutus No. 1, our only anti-Federalist essay. You'll remember that the Federalists were those who wanted ratification of the Constitution. The anti-Federalists were the people who didn't want ratification of the Constitution. Essentially, Brutus argues that the country is too big for a republic, that the people who would be elected would be too far separated from the people they represent. They would become disconnected and corrupt, and therefore this system can't work, and so power ought to remain with the individual states. They argue that the national government is too powerful. They cite the Supremacy Clause. They argue that there's too many economic powers given to the new central government. Noteworthy is the power to tax. They said that federal courts could be used to weaken the rights of the people in the states, and they have a problem with standing armies, which was not uncommon at the time. They're advocating for more of a participatory democracy. That's our only anti-federalist. Let's talk about the big ones, the Federalist Papers. We're going to look at a number of these. The Federalist Papers, of course, are this collection of 85 essays written to argue in favor of ratification of the Constitution, and they give some of our best insight into the thinking of the framers of the Constitution. So let's take a look at probably the most famous of them, Federalist Number 10, written by James Madison in 1787. In this Federalist paper, he talks about factions, the dangers of faction. What's a faction? Well, essentially, it's any group of people that come together united by something that try to have influence. Today, when we think of factions, we think of interest groups, perhaps political parties. Now, those things did not exist at the time, but the same elements that draw people to form interest groups and draw people to form political parties have always existed. It's human nature. And Madison's going to call those factions. He is then going to argue that the Constitution is going to establish this republic, which is the best way to deal with what he calls the mischiefs of factions. He says if we have a large republic, which is something the anti-federalists don't want, he says if we have a large republic, it will decrease the likelihood that any one faction could gain too much influence and thereby threaten the liberty of minorities. He says if in a small government, it's much more likely that those factions would have too much influence. And so we're actually remedying the problem the anti-federalists complained about with a large republic. We're remedying the problem that liberty is going to be threatened. This is advocating for what would be pluralist democracy. Federalist number 51, again written by Madison. In this one, he is going to talk about the structure of the government, the checks and balances, separation of powers. He famously says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But guess what? Men ain't angels. And so he says, therefore, we have created this form of government that does not allow any one branch of the government to have too much power. We see this with the separation of powers. Again, each individual department has their own responsibilities, and through checks and balances. The fact that no branch of the government can act independently without some chance that they will be checked by the other branches. The executive can check the legislative can check the judicial and the executive, so on and so forth. The judicial can check both of them. He also is going to argue that this new structure of government is going to prevent tyranny of the majority. Federalist number 70, now we get into Hamilton. He was going to write this one in 1788. He is going to talk about the executive branch, the one that perhaps Hamilton really thought most highly of. He is going to talk about the need for what he calls an energetic executive, that is the leading character in the definition of good government. Now, he's not talking about a king. Absolutely not. But what he is talking about is a single individual that is going to be the executive that is going to be provided with the powers necessary to have a good government, to function well. And he says there are 4 ingredients with this, and he talks about the fact that we only need to have one. They need to be held accountable, so on and so forth. And he makes this argument that the best way that we can have an executive branch is to have one person. He cites examples in history where there were more than one within an executive branch, and he says that's not very good. This idea of one executive, a president, which is energetic, as Hamilton calls them, provided with the power to function, to do what is necessary to get the job done, is going to, over time, lead to a presidency that has been enhanced beyond the express powers found in Article 2. Article 2 of the Constitution is rather short. It doesn't give a whole lot of direction to the presidency. But kind of the Hamiltonian view is that is a bedrock document, and that as time goes on, presidents need to be given the power necessary to carry out their functions. And we've seen that over time. Federalist 78, we're back with Hamilton again. This time he's talking about the judicial branch. He says it is the least dangerous of all the branches. Why? Because he says it controls neither the sword or the purse. In other words, it does not have the ability to carry out, to enforce its decisions. The sword, and it doesn't have any control over money. The purse, that's the legislative branch. And so, therefore, individuals who are critical of the judicial branch should not be worried because it is the least dangerous. To critics of the Constitution, say, hey, what about this lifetime appointment thing? So all federal judges are appointed to a lifetime tenure. Hamilton says, whoa, 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 that is only in times of good behavior. Lifetime appointment does not mean that you can never, there's nothing you could do that could get you removed. He's going to argue for judicial review, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that individual laws, decisions made, statutes should not be able to override that. And so he's going to argue that the judicial branch is going to be able to stand up to those laws that don't fall in line with the Constitution. Later down the road, this is going to be codified in the famous Marbury versus Madison case, which of course is required for AP government. He's going to argue for the supremacy of the Constitution, that the supremacy clause is in fact important. It's another aspect of good government. And in short, the structure of the judicial system protects the Supreme Court's independence, that the court should be free to operate without concern of political or outside pressure. And our final foundational document is the easiest to read because it's not written in old-timey language, because it's from the 20th century. It's a letter from Birmingham jail written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he was, get this, in Birmingham jail. It's actually a letter that was written to ministers critical of King's tactics, people who said, listen, we agree with you, but we don't agree with how you're going about it. He expresses his disappointments with what he calls the white moderate. And then he goes on to explain why the nonviolent protests that they are doing, the breaking unjust laws, why that makes sense. Because he distinguishes between a just and an unjust law within the context of natural law. He says unjust laws are those that violate a higher law, a natural law, a moral law. He also says that the goals of the civil rights movements are actually the same as the goals of America. He goes through and he gives some historical reference as to why what they're doing, arguing for their rights, for their freedom, for their liberty, is very much in line with what previous generations of patriots had argued for. This document is most closely associated with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause that is found within, because after all, the Equal Protection Clause is the basis for modern civil rights. So there you have it. Those are the foundational documents for AP government. Very brief overview. This should not serve as a substitute for reading them and doing any assigned classwork regarding them, but if you needed a quick refresher course, we hope that this one was helpful.